Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. I have returned. I got back in late last night from Belgium. It was a long travel day, about 18 hours from the time I got to the airport to the time I pulled into my driveway, but all worth it. You're going to be seeing a lot of content both here and on VTH Extra from that trip in the coming weeks. In fact, one little video is already up, and I'll throw up a link at the end. That's a little video I did with Matt Leach, who played Floyd Talbert in Band of Brothers. Great guy, who I consider a friend I've gotten to know over the last year, over 3 tours that we've done together now. So I'll throw that up at the end, and you can be watching for that, and definitely subscribe to VTH Extra because I'll be putting up some of the non-historical parts of my trip on there in the coming weeks. But for now, I had a lot of people messaging me while I was gone saying, hey, Mr. Beat uploaded a follow-up to every president's greatest achievement with one about every president's biggest mistake. And Matt actually texted me the day that this video came out to let me know that he had done this video. So I think I was in London at the time he messaged me about that. So I'm excited to dive into this one. As always, the link is in the description to the original content. I encourage you highly to check his channel out. If you haven't already, please do so. Let's dive in.
Mr. Beat, you got a problem with that, huh? Step up if you got a problem with that. Come on, let's go.
I'll say this. He's a muscular guy. He's pretty buff. You can't necessarily tell in all his videos, but I'm not going to step up.
I'm sorry, I'm just in a bad mood after researching for this video. It's got me all negative, cynical, paranoid. You see, this video is about mistakes. Look, all human beings make mistakes. No one is perfect. This is why everyone should be canceled. Anyway, American presidents are not immune to this. This video is about the greatest mistake of every American president while they were in office. Their worst failure.
So important for me to highlight what he just said, because I think some people missed that on the last video when I did the reaction to every president's greatest achievement. He said at the beginning, he's talking about while they were in office, because I kept getting comments from people, come on, what about the Declaration of Independence? No, that wasn't while Thomas Jefferson was in office, so he has limited this to while they were president, so keep that in mind.
Their biggest oopsie. You get it. When I say greatest mistake, I mean the one thing they did that hurt the most people. And when I say thing they did that hurt the most people, I say it with my historian hat on, looking at all of American history. So I guess recent presidents have the advantage of all of us not knowing the full extent of damage they truly have done. Okay, let's do this. George Washington. Even my favorite president wasn't perfect. The biggest flaw in his presidency was his failure to use his influence to call for an end to slavery. By the time he was president, he had long privately said that slavery was bad and needed to go away, but his worry of his own financial security prevented him from freeing his own slaves. Imagine if such a unifying figure as Washington went public about him being against slavery and freeing all his slaves while president. The country would have been so much better off in the following decades.
All right, so I'm going to let him say everything he wants to say about each one, and then I'll respond at the end. I get where he's coming from on this one. I understand what he's saying here, but I feel like the moment George Washington made a concerted effort to try and end slavery, he wouldn't have been the unifying figure anymore. We know from how divisive the Constitutional Convention and the ratification process was, how much the South had their heels dug in on the issue of slavery. I feel like Washington, for all of the deification that people had done of him and have done of him, would not have had any more success on that issue than anybody else. But I get what he's saying there. I try to shy away from the hypotheticals like that when I think about what presidents could have done, but I get it.
John Adams.
Oh, this is easy.
Adams signed the Alien and Sedition
Easy.
Acts, 4 of the worst laws in American history. The Naturalization Act made it harder to become a citizen. The Alien Friends Act allowed the president to easily imprison or deport any foreigner who they thought was dangerous. The Alien Enemies Act gave the president even more powers to detain foreigners during a war. And the Sedition Act, which was the worst of them all in my opinion, made it illegal to talk trash or make up fake news about the federal government. I hope you realize the Sedition Act spit all over the First Amendment.
So it's those acts, some of which I think are still on the books, actually. I don't think they've all been repealed or like superseded by something, but I think some of them might be. Which I thought of immediately when I was doing the reaction to the whole Abraham Lincoln was the first dictator thing. Man, some of that stuff that Adams signed in that bill was very dictatorial. I can deport you as president. I have the power to just deport people. Arresting people for speaking out against the government. That's some dictatorial type stuff. And this was by one of the founding fathers. This is one of the guys who was the strongest voice behind the independence movement. John Adams with the Alien Sedition Act is probably one of the biggest no-brainers in this whole bunch.
Thomas Jefferson. First of all, Jefferson, of course, was even worse than George Washington when it came to slavery. Sure, for most of his life, he called for it to eventually end, and he did sign a law to ban the importation of slaves while president, but he likely fathered multiple enslaved children with one of his young slaves, and owned more slaves than any other president in American history, and he didn't free almost all of them. Ugh, Jefferson. But that all aside, I think his biggest mistake while he was president was signing the Embargo Act of 1807. It banned pretty much all trade with Britain and France. Jefferson supported the law in order to avoid war with both countries, but it ended up devastating the American economy. The country lost tens of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of jobs.
Yeah, hard to argue with that one. I think by and large Jefferson had a pretty successful presidency, but that was, and you'll notice I'm going to guess that a lot of these are going to come toward the end of their presidencies. In Jefferson's case, that was right at the end of his second term in office when all of that went down, or not right at the end, but in the middle of his second term. And defenders of Jefferson will point out that even if he wanted to free his slaves, there were some laws in place that because of the debt that he had incurred, that he really couldn't free a lot of his slaves. And that's kind of true. But at the same time, I feel like that is a fallback position. I don't know that Jefferson would have anyway. You notice a lot of the folks who were slave owners, when they did free them, they put it into their will so that while their lifetime it couldn't happen, afterwards it would happen. Pass the buck on to the next person, so to speak. But let's move on.
James Madison. In my video about every president's greatest accomplishment, I said Madison's biggest achievement was holding Britain back during the War of 1812. Ironically, though, I think his biggest mistake was failing to prevent that war from happening in the first place. Yeah. They called it, quote, Mr. Madison's War, for good reason. After all, he convinced a divided Congress to move forward with declaring war on a much more powerful country that could easily defeat them if it really wanted to. It was reckless, to say the least.
It was reckless, but he also understood that Britain was in the middle of a war with Napoleon on the continent, and that was a much bigger and much closer threat. So I think maybe part of the mindset was, well, they're kind of occupied already, so while we're 3,000 miles away, maybe we can, replicate what we did in the Revolutionary War and let France handle the bulk of the work while we do what we want to do here. So I think I'd probably agree that was his biggest mistake, but I don't know if it was a huge mistake.
James Monroe. Monroe's biggest mistake was signing the Missouri Compromise. I used to be more indifferent about the law, but after learning more about it, I can more confidently now say It was a major cause of the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to maintain the equal balance of slave states and free states that had already existed. It also prohibited slavery north of a line of latitude west of the southern border of Missouri, despite the fact that Monroe had expressed several times that he wanted slavery eventually abolished. This law, in fact, made the institution more permanent. Sure, it avoided a national crisis, but it only kicked the can down the road. The crisis would only get worse later on, and Monroe could have prevented it.
He was with me until the last part there where he said Monroe could have prevented it. I'm not sure that's the case. And one common theme with all these presidents leading up to the American Civil War is that they kicked the can down the road. It seems like nobody had an answer because there was such division over this issue between North and South that pretty much the only thing that anybody ever seemed to be able to do was to come up with a compromise that pushed the issue back. The Missouri Compromise was one of those examples. Admit one slave state and one free state. Why? Because it keeps the number of senators in the U.S. Senate, which every state gets 2 senators, it keeps the number of senators between free states and slave state representation equal, so that no side could get an advantage in the Senate that might help them determine laws moving forward. And so, could Monroe have prevented it by not signing the Missouri Compromise? I'm not sure that was the case, because I don't know what the answer is. I look at all of these presidencies and I look at all of these ways in which they kicked the can down the road, and I just don't see a solution. And backing up for a second to something he said about Jefferson signing the law that banned the slave trade. That was something that during Jefferson's administration, that was the first time that was able to happen, because there was a provision in the Constitution that after the adoption of the Constitution, there had to be at least 20 years go by before they could do anything about the slave trade, which was the importation of new enslaved people from Africa, or from anywhere for that matter. And the ending of the slave trade actually, in some ways, made slavery more lucrative, because now you couldn't import new ones, and so the ones that you had suddenly became more valuable and a more precious commodity, which I hate that we talk about people that way, but that's how they saw it in the South.
John Quincy Adams. You all know me. I'm still the same old teach. I hate tariffs because they make stuff more expensive for you and me. As it turns out, JQ's biggest mistake was signing the Tariff of 1828, or as I and other critics like to call it, the Tariff of Abominations. It hurt both industry and farming alike, and even led to the nullification crisis.
So Andrew Jackson, or not Andrew Jackson because he's on the screen, John Quincy Adams, one of the big cornerstones of his administration was his desire for infrastructure to take place, like investing in infrastructure, new roads, canals, things like that, to help build the internal structure of the country, right, and to help in that way. Well, the federal government, its main and really only main source of revenue was tariffs. And so in order to pay for some of that stuff, of course, they had to pass new tariffs. And tariffs were, like a lot of other things, a north-south dividing type issue. And we've talked about that in other videos. I will say this. I feel like maybe, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Matt on this one, but I feel like maybe he's kind of acknowledging that he's put his own bias into this. Since he doesn't like tariffs, he's going to tend to see tariffs that get passed by a president as being a bad thing. And listen, we all do that. We all have our biases. We all have our worldview, and we're going to see everything through that. I'm no different. I do the exact same thing.
Andrew Jackson. Of course, his signing of the Indian Removal Act and causing the Trail of Tears was horrible, but I think Jackson's ill-informed, hard money policies ultimately hurt even more people. He refused to establish a new Bank of the United States, instead allowing state banks to just freely loan paper money to pretty much anyone who asked for it. In response to this crisis, Jackson issued an executive order that required all payments payment for federal government land to be paid for in either gold or silver. Well, this caused inflation to soar. Eventually, this all at least partially led to the Panic of 1837 and one of the worst depressions in American history. Normally, the president doesn't have much control over the economy, but Jackson's actions certainly played a big role causing this economic crisis.
I would disagree with him that the president doesn't normally have a lot of control over the economy, because I think there are a lot of policies that a president does have influence over, especially when he demonstrated right there with an executive order, which Jackson was all about executive orders, which is really interesting to me. Because he came from the Democratic South. He born in North Carolina. Well, born in the Carolinas. We don't know for sure if it was North or South Carolina, but represents the state of Tennessee when he gets into office. But was very much about the power of the executive and using it. Also, the last time in history that we had we were debt free as a nation. I don't know enough about the fiscal policies in the economy at this time to really be able to say one way or the other about this, so I'll let Matt's comment stand on this one.
Martin Van Buren. So what was the Trail of Tears? Well, it was a series of forced displacements of around 60,000 people from the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. They were forced out of their homes in the southeast and marched out west for thousands of miles. Most ended up in future Oklahoma. The relocated suffered from disease and starvation on the way, traveling often through harsh conditions. Andrew Jackson may have signed the Indian Removal Act and started the Trail of Tears, but it was Van Buren who carried out the most infamous part of the Trail of Tears: the removal of the Cherokee from Georgia. At least 4,000 of them died, many of them babies or small children, as they traveled on foot through a particularly harsh winter, most with no shoes on and little clothing.
And the Cherokee were at the heart of the crisis that was happening during Andrew Jackson's administration. The Cherokee had, by and large, become a quote-unquote civilized tribe. They started to dress like Americans did. They actually had a very similar democratic form of government, but they wanted self-government, and they wanted to be able to kind of be autonomous. And Andrew Jackson kind of put his foot down in the Supreme Court. The Cherokee went to the Supreme Court, won the case in the Supreme Court, and then Andrew Jackson basically said, well, they made their ruling, now let's see them enforce it. And he did what he wanted anyway. But he's right, it did actually happen under Van Buren.
William Henry Harrison. Yeah, Harrison's biggest mistake while president was drinking the D.C. water. That's apparently what got him sick and led to his death just a month into his presidency.
Yeah, a lot of people say it was because he caught a cold while he was giving a speech, but more modern research shows that it was probably something in the water, maybe cholera, something like that killed not only him, but others. Maybe Zachary Taylor, maybe had an impact on Polk, who died just after leaving office. There was definitely some issues there.
John Tyler. Believe it or not, Tyler didn't make many mistakes as president. Then again, he didn't accomplish much as president either. I think his biggest mistake was refusing to reestablish a national bank. He even vetoed a bill to charter one. While central banks have not always made things completely all rosy throughout history, most economists argue that they have kept markets stable and helped prevent economic crashes. In fact, that aforementioned Panic of 1837 likely would have been avoided if there had been a central bank in place to regulate banking transactions and help failing banks. After Tyler vetoed the national bank, it wouldn't come back for a while, and for the rest of the century, the country experienced some of its worst bank runs and recessions ever.
And completely unrelated to his presidency, but John Tyler is one of two presidents, U.S. presidents, who were citizens of the Confederate States of America. In fact, Tyler had been elected to the Confederate Congress, but died before taking his seat in 1862. The other was he who must not be named. You know who I mean by that. In fact, I think I'm wearing the shirt today. Am I? I am. Suck it, Wilson. Available in the merch store.
James Polk. Polk's biggest mistake was starting an unjust war with Mexico. Polk was basically an imperialist who knew that if he sent troops into disputed territory along the Texas-Mexico border, he would likely be starting a war. In fact, I'd argue he hoped it would happen. To Mexico, it was an invasion. It was completely reasonable for Mexico to attack American troops, as a matter of fact, which they did on April 25th, 1846. Polk couldn't have designed it any better. He went to Congress, urging them to declare war on Mexico, claiming that they, quote, shed American blood upon American soil. Congress, of course, went along with it. But it's long past due that we all admit that the Mexican-American War was a war of aggression, a war of imperialism meant simply to expand the nation's borders.
Yeah, 100% true. And men like Grant, who served in the Mexican War, saw it as that at the time. Abraham Lincoln was in Congress at the time, and he spoke out strongly against the Mexican War for the same reasons. There's no other way to look at that. It absolutely was a war of conquest. And it's one of several times in history, not only in world history, but in American history, where an event was used to spin to the American people an argument for a just response in war. The USS Maine's an example. Probably the Gulf of Tonkin incident would be an example of that in U.S. history.
Zachary Taylor. Taylor was only in office for 16 months, but that was enough to make mistakes. Taylor's biggest mistake was raising tensions in the months leading up to the Compromise of 1850. Despite being a slave owner himself, Taylor rejected any compromise with the slave states to let them expand slavery out west, as originally agreed to under the Missouri Compromise. I appreciated Taylor taking the very clear anti-slavery stance, but in doing so, his rhetoric only further disillusioned Southern leaders and sped up the path straight toward civil war, which I guess was inevitable by this point, but still, Taylor made it worse.
So, I will say this, and I love Matt, and I more often than not agree with him, but I'm just trying to, maybe I'm just misunderstanding, and maybe somebody can set me straight on this, but I'm trying to understand why the Missouri Compromise was bad, but Taylor refusing to compromise was also bad. I guess this all goes back to the point that I don't know if there was any good solution leading up to the Civil War. It is interesting that during this time we have northern presidents who side with the southern slave owners, and we have southern slave-owning presidents who side with the North on this stuff during all of this time. But yeah, I mean, I agree. Pretty much every president in this time period leading up to the Civil War is going to drop the ball on the slavery issue.
Millard Fillmore.
Alec Baldwin.
After Taylor died in office, Fillmore took over and supported the Compromise of 1850. Except that he was perfectly fine with the worst part of it. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it so that the federal government was responsible for finding and returning escaped slaves, even if they were in a free state. Yep, free states had to cooperate. This was definitely a law that led directly to the Civil War.
It was, but it was also reiterating something that was already in the U.S. Constitution. The idea of the Fugitive Slave Act has its roots in the Constitution, which basically said that free states did not have the right to deny slave owners their rights to their property. So the Fugitive Slave Act was just encoding in law what was already enshrined in the Constitution. Yeah, it was a horrible law. We all recognize that. And it definitely did lead to the Civil War. But its roots go back much further than Millard Fillmore.
Franklin Pierce. Speaking of laws that led directly to the Civil War, the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Bad one. Bad.
Pierce signed that law, which is easily one of the worst federal laws ever passed in American history. It opened Kansas for settlement and allowed the new settlers to determine whether it would be admitted as a slave state or a free state. Naturally, this caused a mad rush of pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates to Kansas, and violence would often occur between the two groups. That's how the territory earned the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Pierce literally caused the prequel to the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely true, and it was a violation of the Missouri Compromise. Actually, you have both Zachary Taylor and Franklin Pierce kind of going back on the Missouri Compromise, right? Taylor opposing the expansion of slavery in areas that were guaranteed by the Missouri Compromise, and now you have Franklin Pierce violating it on the north side of things by supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act and allowing for self-determination. And, who didn't see that coming, right? Who couldn't have recognized that pro and anti-slavery people were going to flood that area to try and turn the tide in one direction or another? Why does all this matter? And it's really the issue of expansion of slavery that's going to lead to secession, right? Because Abraham Lincoln was elected on a platform not of eliminating slavery, but of opposing its expansion into new territories. Again, opposing the Missouri Compromise. And the South understood that an end to expansion was really the first step in the death of slavery itself. Because eventually, if you expand west and add new states, and they're all free states, pretty soon you start adding more and more people in Congress, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, who oppose slavery, and eventually you're going to have the votes to eliminate it altogether. So they were just looking down the road at what was coming. Expansion was absolutely vital to keeping the institution of slavery alive.
James Buchanan. Sure, Buchanan was a corrupt dude who did some shady stuff to help only him and his friends while in office, but his biggest mistake was allowing southern states to secede. Not only did he refuse to send down federal troops to prevent them from doing so, he didn't even talk trash about southern leaders when they began to do so. He was like, oh, well, I personally don't think seceding is a good idea, but you do you, South. So Buchanan didn't just do nothing to prevent the Civil War, he did something to cause it. Isn't that something?
I don't know what Buchanan could have done, short of doing what Lincoln did, which was to raise troops and put down the rebellion, or at least occupy the states and keep them from seceding. Maybe if he had acted quickly, it doesn't turn into a civil war that kills 750,000 people. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I will say this, and I don't know how much Buchanan was aware of it, but his own Secretary of War, John Floyd, who is later on going to be one of the generals at Fort Donelson, was very actively redistributing weapons and ammunition and supplies from northern armories and forts into southern ones, anticipating that a war might break out, and strategically placing a lot of federal government property in places where the South could easier get their hands on it, knowing what was coming. Did Buchanan know about it? I don't know, but if he did, he should have been doing something about it.
Abraham Lincoln. You may already be noticing a pattern here. If you mess with the First Amendment, I got problems with you. And yes, Abraham Lincoln messed with the First Amendment. He arrested journalists and newspaper publishers who criticized his handling of the Civil War. His administration censored mail and telegraphs that undermined the war. Lincoln had people arrested singing Confederate songs, for crying out loud. I don't care if it was wartime. That's messed up, man.
And I won't disagree with any of that. Totally agree those were the worst things Lincoln did. I think sometimes, though, and I don't know specifically about the one with the song, somebody could look it up and comment in the comment section below, but sometimes Lincoln gets accused of things that people did under him that once it got found out, he actually corrected. A perfect example was when I did the reaction a couple weeks ago to the video about Lincoln as a dictator, and there was a claim made in that video that priest who refused to say a prayer for Abraham Lincoln, that Lincoln had that guy arrested. And that absolutely is a twisting of the facts. In fact, it was a colonel or brigadier general, someone who actually arrested the guy. He was a bishop in the South. And once the Lincoln administration found out that happened, they intervened and had the guy released. So Lincoln was getting blamed for something that he actually opposed. I don't know if that's the case with that one, but there's no getting around the fact that Lincoln absolutely was violating the Constitution with how he dealt with some people in response to the rebellion.
Andrew Johnson.
Tommy Lee Jones?
Yeah, I think Johnson made plenty of mistakes, but I think his biggest one was causing the Black Codes to happen. The Black Codes were laws passed by southern states designed to make the lives of recently freed slaves miserable. Essentially, slavery was now illegal after the passing of the 13th Amendment, but the Black Codes made it so African Americans still felt enslaved. After the Civil War ended, Johnson allowed pro-slavery southern legislatures to quickly take back over, and yeah, nearly all of them passed Black Codes.
Yeah, so Johnson's from the South, and that was intentional. Lincoln was running on basically a Union ticket with a Southern Democratic pro-slavery senator and military governor from Tennessee who would remain loyal to the Union. He was, I think, trying a little too hard to kind of be deferential to the South there. He'd actually considered General Rosecrans at one point, who was from Ohio, to be his running mate, and that would have been so much better. But yeah, among the things that happen here is that in the South, they basically pass laws that allow for contracts that have to be signed. So if you're a newly freed black person, and the biggest mistake, I don't think so much that Johnson caused the Black Codes, but he created the situation that allowed for those things to be gotten away with. If the freedmen, is what they were called, had been given what they were promised, we always hear the term 40 acres and a mule, right? If they had been helped to be able to get established afterwards, they wouldn't have found themselves in a situation where they felt obligated to enter into these contracts, which basically meant that they were signing themselves over into slavery again, because they would sign these contracts that basically said, I'm going to work for you. And a lot of times they were working for the same people who had once owned them, who were their slave owners. I'm going to work for you for such and such an amount of time. You're going to provide room and board for me, but no pay. And I can't leave if I want to. And you can even sell my contract to someone else. So basically they were slaves in all but name. It was really very little difference. And there were a lot of other things too, obviously.
Ulysses Grant. Grant's biggest mistake was supporting and enforcing the Comstock laws. It all started with his signing of the Comstock Act of 1873, which made it illegal to mail stuff or receive stuff in the mail that was obscene, lewd, immoral, or indecent. It was another slap in the face of the First Amendment. After Grant signed the law, a dude named Anthony Comstock, who all these laws were named after, became the enforcer against bad stuff in the mail. He arrested an activist named Ezra Haywood after Haywood mailed one of his pamphlets, which made the claim that women should have the right to control their own bodies. Comstock also arrested another dude for receiving the pamphlet in the mail.
Okay, so I don't disagree with him that was a bad law. I'm not sure that was if the standard is the law that hurt the most number of people and things like that. I'm not sure if that would be that for me. I could think of, obviously the war in 1876, what we call the Great Sioux War, which Grant oversaw. Maybe even just some of the people he put into positions of power in his cabinet and the damage that they did and the ways in which they were pretty corrupt. So I don't know. I don't know if that was the worst, but it was certainly bad.
Rutherford Hayes. Okay, Hayes, I get why you did this as part of the Compromise of 1877, but it still sucked that you did it. Hayes' biggest mistake was removing federal troops from the South, marking the end of Reconstruction and directly leading to a dramatic rise of white supremacist rule throughout the South. African Americans no longer had federal protection and for decades would be treated in the South as second-class citizens.
All right, so I get it. Hayes gets the blame for this. But a couple of things I just want to point out. Number one, if you read Grant's memoirs, for example, he points out very clearly that you see the death of Reconstruction unfolding in Grant's second term, because Northern public sentiment was turning increasingly against Reconstruction. People were tired of the federal troops being in the South. They were tired of dealing with that stuff. I'm not saying it was right, because obviously we know that pulling the troops out, it absolutely did, but lead to probably a century or more of just horrible treatment for African Americans in the South. But I don't think that blame should go on Hayes. That blame goes on the American people for turning against the idea of Reconstruction. Let's say, for example, that Hayes had not gotten elected and made the agreement, the compromise that leads to him pulling the troops out. What's the alternative? Samuel Tilden gets elected president. What's Samuel Tilden going to do? Pull the troops out of the South. It was happening in either case, no matter who got elected. And like I said, if you look at Grant's second term, you start to see him backing off of enforcing some of the stuff because he was losing public support for it. And he talks about that in his autobiography, about how he just couldn't get the things done in his second term in dealing with the stuff in the South that he could in his first term because of public support.
James Garfield. Garfield's biggest mistake was letting the media know his schedule. That's how Charles Guiteau knew Garfield was going to be at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station on July 2nd, 1881. There, Guiteau shot Garfield. Now, Garfield's other biggest mistake was trusting his doctor, Willard Bliss. Garfield was actually starting to recover before Bliss screwed things up. While trying to get his bullet out with unsterilized fingers and tools, he caused a severe infection, which ultimately led to Garfield dying from septic shock.
100% agree. Letting Bliss be his doctor, worst mistake. And why is that the mistake that hurt the most people? Because I think Garfield was a brilliant guy, a compassionate guy. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, because, we tend to, see the best in people. Like Kennedy, I think, for example, really gets overblown as a president because of how he died and because of kind of we look at a potential a lot more than actual reality when people have their terms cut short like that. But I really do think Garfield would have been a really, really good president had he had the opportunity.
Chester Arthur. Arthur's biggest mistake was signing the Chinese Exclusion Act.
100%.
Another one of the worst laws in American history. It banned the immigration of Chinese who were coming over to do manual, unskilled labor, which the country desperately needed help with, by the way. It led to similar laws that further discriminated against Chinese Americans in the coming decades. Not only that, it led to what's known as the driving out era, a period in which anti-Chinese Americans assaulted and even killed Chinese Americans if they didn't get out of their communities. The bottom line is, Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act because of xenophobia, an irrational fear of Chinese people.
Yeah, and that's hardly the only time that's happened throughout our history, right? There have been here where I live in Northeast Ohio in the 1920s, there were these huge Klan rallies that happened, and they were protesting Italian immigration and Catholic immigration and Irish, things like that. So there's always been, it's not a justification or a defense of it, it's wrong every time. There's always been irrational fear of different groups of people immigrating over time.
Grover Cleveland. How about another crappy law? Cleveland's biggest mistake was signing the Dawes Act. The law said the president could subdivide Native American tribal communal land holdings into portions for individual heads of families to privately own, and opened up leftover plots to the general public to settle. This law single-handedly led to tribes across the country losing around 62% of their land, but its main goal was to force them to be more like Americans.
Yeah, and you see a lot of that where they start shipping Native Americans, especially children, east. In Pennsylvania, for example, there was a school. They were trying to Americanize and Christianize the Native Americans. They felt like, okay, we don't want to fight and exterminate them through war. We want to assimilate them and force them to abandon their culture and things like that. And absolutely, it was a bad thing. Not anything we should be proud of at all. And it also led to something called, I think it was called the Dawes Roll, which was where they basically did a census. And it's one good thing that came out of this, because it gave us good documentation of who these Native American people were, and now it allows people to be able to find out their connections to it and stuff like that, but it doesn't justify it. I'm actually going to stop right there because we're about halfway through all of the presidents. There's still we've gotten through 16 and a half minutes. There's still about 22 minutes to go in all of this, but I feel like I've talked a lot, and this is a pretty long video already. So we're going to break this up into two parts, and we'll pick things up with Benjamin Harrison tomorrow. So I'll throw those links up. Check out my video that it's only a minute long that I did with Matt, my friend Matt, talking about the We Happy Few podcast that I'm going to be on down the road at some point. Check out my own podcast and some of the other links down in the description below, and we'll see you again tomorrow with part 2 of this video. Thanks for watching.